We begin, as we always do, with the plain truth. At 30 years old, Naomi Ashcroft had exactly $11 to her name, no roof she could call her own, and a trunk of belongings so light she could carry the whole of her life in one arm. She had been cast out of the only home she had known for 8 years by her late husband's father, a hard and unforgiving man named Josiah Ashcroft, who declared before the whole of Gray Harbor that she had brought nothing but grief to his son and would bring nothing but grief to his house. And so, with those $11 folded into a handkerchief and pinned inside her coat, Naomi did the only thing left that made any sense to a woman with nothing to lose. She walked to the county courthouse steps on an auction day in the autumn of 1897, and for 9 of those precious dollars, she bought the old abandoned lighthouse out at Cormorant Point, a crumbling tower the town itself had given up on years before. The men gathered their laugh behind their hands. They called it a fool's purchase, a heap of stone and rust not worth the paper of its own deed. What none of them knew, what not even Naomi herself yet understood, was that hidden beneath the lighthouse's spiral stairs lay a secret sealed away by the last keeper who ever tended its lamp, a secret that would not only change the shape of her own life, but return to an entire town something it believed had been lost forever. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Naomi Ashcroft. If you are watching this from a place that others have written off as finished, or forgotten, or not worth the trouble, tell us in the comments, because this story is for you. Naomi had been raised not in Gray Harbor but 2 coves further south, in a fishing settlement called Innis Cove, where her father mended nets for a living and her mother took in mending of a different kind, sewing wedding dresses and burial shrouds with the same steady hand. It was a childhood built on tides and thrift, on knowing exactly how far a coin could stretch and exactly how much could be salvaged from what other people threw away. Her mother used to say that nothing in this world was truly worthless, only misunderstood, and she proved it daily, turning flour sacks into curtains, turning broken crockery into mosaic trivets that sold at the church fair, turning a girl with quick hands and a quicker mind into a young woman who could fix nearly anything that came before her. It was from her father that Naomi learned the sea itself, how to read a sky before a storm, how to tell by the color of the water where the shoals lay hidden, how to coil a rope so it would never tangle when it mattered most. And it was from both of them, together, that she learned the deepest lesson of her early life, that dignity was not something given to you by other people's opinions, but something you built, plank by plank, inside your own conduct, regardless of who was watching. She met Thomas Ashcroft when she was 22, a quiet, broad-shouldered young man from Gray Harbor who came down to Innis Cove each summer to buy netting from her father's shop. He did not court her with flowery words, but with patience, arriving each season with some small repaired gift, a hinge he had fixed, a birdhouse he had built, proof, he said, that he too believed nothing broken was beyond mending. They married in the spring of 1889, and Naomi moved north to Gray Harbor to live under the roof of Thomas's father, Josiah, a stern widower who had built a modest fortune in the herring trade and who never quite forgave his son for marrying a girl with no name and no dowry beyond her own 2 hands. Still, for a time, the household held together well enough. Thomas was gentle where his father was hard, and Naomi found small ways to make herself useful and, she hoped, beloved. She kept the account books precise to the penny, she nursed the sick when illness came through town, she mended the fishing nets of half the harbor for a fair price and sometimes for none at all, when a family could not pay. She was, by every measure the town could see, a good and capable woman. But capability, she would learn, is a fragile currency in the hands of those who resent you for having it. The trouble began not with a single blow but with a slow erosion, the way the sea itself takes a shoreline, a little more each season, until one day the map no longer matches the land. Thomas fell ill in the winter of 1894 with a fever that the town doctor could not name and could not cure, and within 6 weeks he was gone, leaving Naomi a widow at 27 with no children to comfort her and a father-in-law who looked at her, from that day forward, as though she were a debt he had not agreed to inherit. Josiah Ashcroft had never been a warm man, but grief hardened him further, and in his grief he needed somewhere to place the blame for a son who had died too young, and Naomi, present, capable, unrelated to him by blood, became the vessel for that blame. He began to say, quietly at first and then loudly, that she had never truly belonged in Grey Harbor, that she had married above her station, that some women simply carried misfortune with them the way others carried a scent of lavender. It was cruel and it was untrue, but grief does not require truth to spread, only a willing mouth and a town eager for a story, and within 3 years, the whisper had become accepted fact in certain parlors. The final blow came in the fall of 1897, when Josiah's own herring business, already strained by 2 poor seasons, collapsed under the weight of a bad loan he had taken from a merchant named Emmett Vance, a smooth, ambitious man newly arrived in Grey Harbor who had been quietly buying up debts and small parcels of land along the coast for reasons no one in town yet understood. Josiah, humiliated and searching once more for someone to hold responsible, turned his fury on Naomi, accusing her, without a shred of evidence, of having mismanaged the very account books she had kept faithfully for years. He put her out of the house on a gray October morning with nothing but her trunk and the $11 she had managed, in secret, to save from her own mending work over the years, money he did not know existed and therefore could not take from her. She stood on the road outside the house that had never truly been hers, watching the door close, and felt for the first time in her adult life entirely and utterly alone. And yet, even in that moment, some quiet stubborn part of her, the part her mother had built plank by plank, refused to believe that this was the end of her story rather than simply a difficult chapter in the middle of it. She heard of the Lighthouse auction almost by accident, standing outside the courthouse 2 days later trying to decide whether to spend her small fortune on a room at the boarding house or on passage south to relatives who might, or might not, take her in. A notice pinned to the board announced the sale of county-forfeited properties, and among the parcels, a fishing shack, a burned-out mill, a strip of marshland no one wanted, was listed the old Cormorant Point Lighthouse and Keeper's Cottage, abandoned these 11 years since the light had been decommissioned in favor of a newer beacon up the coast. The auctioneer, a portly man named Whitcomb, read the listing with open amusement, noting that the tower had stood empty and untended since old keeper Silas Breddy had died in a winter storm in 1886, that the stairs were said to be unsound, that the whole property was, in his words, fit for nothing but gulls and ghosts. The other bidders laughed along with him. Naomi did not laugh. She thought instead of her mother's voice, telling her that nothing was truly worthless, only misunderstood, and before she had entirely decided to do it, she heard her own voice call out $9, and heard Whitcomb's gavel come down before anyone thought to bid against her, because who in their right mind would spend real money on a ruin like that? She walked the 4 miles out to Cormorant Point that same afternoon, the deed folded in her coat pocket alongside her 2 remaining dollars, and stood for a long while at the base of the tower looking up. It was a squat, sturdy structure of gray fieldstone, built some 50 years before, its lantern room dark and its glass long broken, the keeper's cottage beside it sagging under a roof half stripped of shingles. The wind off the water was sharp and salted, and gulls wheeled overhead as though registering their objection to her trespass. But when she pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside, she found the tower's interior, though thick with dust and cobweb, remarkably dry and sound, the old iron spiral staircase winding up through the center of it like the inside of a great shell. She climbed it slowly that first evening, testing each step, and found the lantern room at the top still holding, astonishingly, a few unbroken panes, through which the last gray light of the day came slanting down the stairwell in long dusty beams. It was, she thought, standing there in the ruin she now owned outright, the first place in 3 years that had asked nothing of her and judged her for nothing at all. It was on her 3rd day of clearing the cottage that she found the first clue, tucked inconspicuously into what she had taken for an ordinary maintenance ledger left behind on a shelf. The book was water-stained and half its pages were illegible, but near the back, in a hand grown shaky with age, she found an entry unlike the routine logs of oil consumption and weather that filled the rest of the pages. It read simply, "To whoever mends this house and climbs these stairs with an honest heart, look to the 13th step, and remember that a promise kept late is still a promise kept." It was signed with the initials SB. Naomi sat with the ledger in her lap for a long while, the wind rattling the loose shutters outside, turning the strange entry over in her mind. She was not a fanciful woman, not given to treasure stories or superstition, but there was something in the specific, deliberate strangeness of the note, 13th step, an honest heart, a promise kept late, that would not let her set the book down and forget it, and that night she lit a stub of candle and climbed the spiral stairs, counting as she went, until she stood upon the 13th tread with her heart beating harder than the climb alone could account for. The 13th step, when she knelt and examined it closely by candlelight, proved different from the others, its iron facing slightly proud of the stone beneath, as though it had been lifted and reset rather than cast in a single piece. It took her the better part of an hour, working with a fire poker and her bare, blistered fingers, to work the facing free, and when it finally gave way with a groan of old metal, she found beneath it not treasure in the gleaming sense the word might suggest, but something in its own way far heavier, a small iron strongbox, rust-sealed shut, and wedged beside it a leather satchel that had somehow, in the dry stone cavity, survived 11 years without rotting through. Her hands shook as she drew them both out into the candlelight, and she sat back on the cold stair with the strongbox in her lap for a long moment before she found the courage to force its latch. Inside the satchel she found letters, dozens of them, tied in bundles with twine gone brittle, along with a second, smaller ledger written in the same careful hand as the note that had led her here. And as she began, in the days that followed, to piece together what these papers actually told, Naomi came to understand that Silas Bretty had not merely been the keeper of a lighthouse, but the keeper of something far more precious to the people of Grey Harbor, their trust, quite literally. The letters revealed that in the spring of 1886, in the wake of a regional bank failure that had wiped out the savings of half the fishing families along that stretch of coast, the town's Fishermen's Mutual Aid Society, a modest cooperative fund built over decades from small weekly contributions, meant to support widows, orphans, and families ruined by bad seasons or lost boats, had faced collapse alongside the bank that had unwisely held its deposits. Rather than see the fund vanish entirely, the society's trustees, fearing further bank failures and unsure whom among the town's own merchants and officials could be trusted with such a sum during such an unstable season, had entrusted the entire remaining fund, converted quietly into coin and a small number of gold certificates, to Silas Bretty, a man universally respected in the town for his honesty, his solitude, and his position at a lighthouse no thief would think to search, to hold in secret until the crisis passed and it was safe to return the money to the society's proper keeping. Silas had done exactly as he was asked, hiding the fund beneath his own stairs with the same careful hands that trimmed his lamp each night, and had begun, the ledger showed, to make quiet plans for its safe return the following spring, once the immediate panic had subsided and a new, sounder bank had been chartered up the coast. But that winter, before the transfer could be made, a storm of a violence the region still spoke of decades later swept the point, and Silas Bretty, climbing his own tower in the black of a February night to trim a failing lamp so that no ship would run aground for want of his diligence, was found dead at the base of the stairs the following morning, whether from the fall or from his heart, no one could say for certain. He had told no living soul of the fund's location beyond the note he had, in some premonition of his own mortality, already carved into that ledger and hidden with the strongbox itself, trusting, in the end, not any particular person, but simply whoever might one day come with an honest heart to inhabit the tower he had kept so faithfully. Without him, and without record of where he had placed it, the town's leadership at the time had quietly concluded the fund was lost, some said stolen by Silas himself in his final months, a rumor that had, Naomi now realized with a slow and rising anger, stained the old keeper's memory for over a decade with a theft he had never committed. It took Naomi the better part of 2 weeks, working by lamp and daylight both, to fully understand the scope of what she now possessed, not simply a strongbox of old currency and gold certificates, though the sum itself, when she finally dared to count it, was larger than she had ever imagined touching in her life, but the key to clearing the name of a man wrongly accused, and the means, quite possibly, to restore something Grey Harbor believed permanently lost. She might, she understood with a clarity that frightened her, simply have kept it. No one alive knew the fund existed at all, let alone that it lay hidden beneath the stairs of a lighthouse she now legally owned. She could have taken the money quietly south, bought herself a comfortable life far from the town that had cast her out and the family that had shamed her, and no one would ever have been the wiser. The thought did cross her mind, in the honest way that such thoughts cross the minds of even good people when they are tired and wronged and holding, quite literally, the means of their own deliverance in a rusted iron box. But she thought also of her mother's hands turning broken crockery into something worth keeping, and of Silas Brady's careful, lonely diligence, trusting a stranger he would never meet with the truth rather than let it die with him in silence, and she understood that to take the money for herself would be to finish the very theft the town had wrongly accused him of committing. Word travels quickly in a small harbor town, and it was not long before whispers began to circulate that the widow Ashcroft, out at the old lighthouse, had found something out there beyond dust and gulls. Naomi had confided cautiously in only one soul at first, Reverend Elias Pruitt, an elderly, plain-spoken minister who had officiated her wedding to Thomas years before and who, alone among Gray Harbor's respectable citizens, had never once repeated Josiah Ashcroft's whispers against her. It was Pruitt who confirmed for her, from the church's old membership rolls and his own long memory, the names of the surviving families who had once paid weekly dues into that vanished mutual aid fund, and it was Pruitt's quiet counsel that convinced her the money must be returned openly, through proper channels, rather than distributed in secret, for a secret restoration, he warned her gently, would only breed new suspicion in a town already primed to suspect her of misdeeds. But it was precisely this plan, public, provable, impossible to quietly suppress, that brought Naomi into direct and dangerous conflict with Emmett Vance, the same smooth merchant whose bad loan had ruined Josiah Ashcroft's business and who had, in the months since, been quietly acquiring parcels of coastal land, including, Naomi now learned, an aggressive standing offer to purchase Cormorant Point itself from the county before her own bid had unexpectedly outpaced him at auction. Vance, it emerged through Pruitt's careful inquiries and the recollection of the courthouse clerk, had wanted the point not for its lighthouse, which he considered worthless, but for the deep, sheltered cove beside it, ideal for a new wharf and warehouse operation he intended to build to service the shipping trade he was quietly cornering along that stretch of coast, an operation that depended, in no small part, on Gray Harbor's fishing families remaining exactly as poor and dependent upon his credit as the failed bank's collapse had left them. A restored mutual aid fund, publicly returned to its rightful families, would undo years of patient work Vance had done buying up debts and loyalty alike, and when word reached him that the widow he had helped ruin now held both the deed to his coveted point and a fortune that threatened his hold on the town, he moved quickly and without scruple to stop her. He began, first, by reviving and sharpening the old rumor against Silas Brady, suggesting publicly that whatever Naomi had found out at the lighthouse was almost certainly the very fund the old keeper was long suspected of embezzling, and that a woman already whispered to bring misfortune wherever she went had now, conveniently, discovered a fortune that was never rightfully hers to find. He petitioned the county to challenge the validity of her auction purchase on a technicality regarding the filing of forfeiture notices, hoping to have the property, and anything found upon it, reverted to county ownership before she could act. And when both of these efforts stalled against Reverend Pruitt's careful documentation and the plain, unbending fact that Naomi had done nothing but purchase a ruin fairly and legally at open auction, Vance resorted to a final, quieter cruelty, pressuring Josiah Ashcroft, still indebted to him and still resentful of his former daughter-in-law, to file a formal claim asserting that anything found on property once connected, however loosely, to the Ashcroft family name rightfully belonged to the Ashcroft estate, and not to a widow he had already publicly disowned. It was, Naomi would later say, the cruelest turn of the entire ordeal, not Vance's scheming, which she had half expected from a man of his reputation, but her father-in-law's willingness to reach for her one discovered fortune even as he had refused her a roof only weeks before. She stood before the county magistrate that winter, in a hearing that half of Gray Harbor came to watch from the gallery, more curious than sympathetic, and laid out, plainly and without embellishment, everything the ledgers and letters had told her, the Mutual Aid Society's original contributions, the panic that had led to Silas Brady's guardianship of the fund, his careful, lonely diligence in hiding and intending to return it, and his tragic death before he could do so. She read aloud, in a voice that did not shake though her hands did, the old keeper's final note about honest hearts and promises kept late, and she watched the gallery's skepticism shift, slowly, into something closer to shame, as the town began to recognize in that dusty, careful handwriting the character of a man they had allowed themselves to slander for over a decade rather than simply admit the money was lost. The magistrate, a fair-minded man named Corwin who had no particular loyalty to Vance's growing influence in the county, ruled in the end exactly as the plain facts demanded, that the Mutual Aid Fund had never belonged to Silas Brady, nor to the Lighthouse, nor to the Ashcroft estate, nor even, strictly, to Naomi herself, but to the surviving members and heirs of the original Mutual Aid Society, precisely as its founding charter had specified, and that as the fund's discoverer and rightful property owner, Naomi Ashcroft would oversee its documented, public return to those families under the church's supervision. Vance's petitions were dismissed outright, and his motives, once Pruitt quietly produced records of his standing offer for the point and his outstanding loans across half the town, were laid bare enough that he found, in the weeks that followed, his credit and his welcome in Gray Harbor rapidly diminishing, until he departed the county entirely the following spring, his wharf scheme abandoned along with the reputation he had spent years carefully building on other people's misfortune. The restoration itself, when it finally came, was not a single dramatic scene but a long, quiet season of small and enormous acts, each one its own kind of justice. Naomi worked through that winter and into the spring with Reverend Pruitt and the surviving elders of the old society, tracing each family's original contributions through what records had survived, and where records had not survived, trusting the plain, remembered honesty of people who had paid their weekly dues for decades and had no reason left to lie about it. The widow Corliss, whose husband's boat had been lost the same year the fund itself was thought lost, received enough to finally replace the roof she had been patching with tar paper for 11 years. The Doyle family, 3 brothers who had scattered to find work elsewhere when the fishing failed, returned to rebuild their father's boat shed. A small portion, at Naomi's own quiet insistence and over the mild objection of a few who wished the whole sum simply divided, was set aside to repair the church roof and to place, at the base of Cormorant Point Lighthouse itself, a modest brass plaque bearing Silas Brady's name and the words "honest to the last," so that no passing sailor or curious child would ever again hear his memory spoken of as a thief's. And Josiah Ashcroft, the man who had cast her from his house with nothing, received not 1 cent from the fund, for he had never been a member of the society and had no rightful claim upon it, but he received, whether he wanted it or not, something perhaps harder to bear, the sight, every week that spring, of the daughter-in-law he had shamed walking through town with her head held plainly high, greeted warmly by name by families who had once merely tolerated her, while his own name, thanks to Vance's collapsed loan and his own petty attempt to claim what was not his, grew quietly smaller in the town's regard. Naomi never sought to humiliate him further, she simply lived, honestly and openly, in the manner her mother had taught her, and let the town draw its own conclusions from the contrast. So we return, as we promised at the start, to that gray October morning when a 30-year-old widow stood outside a house that had never truly been hers, with $11 folded into a handkerchief and nowhere left to go, and we ask you to hold that image now beside the woman she became, the woman who climbed a condemned spiral staircase with a candle stub and an honest heart, exactly as an old keeper's note had asked, and found there not merely a fortune, but a chance to finish a promise that death itself had interrupted. Naomi Ashcroft did not restore Gray Harbor because she owed it anything. The town had, after all, given her little enough reason to love it. She restored it because she understood, better than most, that a thing left unmended is not the same as a thing not worth mending, and that the truest measure of a person's worth is never what others say of them in their absence, but what they choose to do when no one is left to make them do it. The lighthouse at Cormorant Point stands still today, they say, its lamp relit at Naomi's own expense the following year, guiding boats home along a coast that had once nearly lost far more than its ships. Thank you, truly, for spending this time with us and with Naomi's story. If it moved you even a little, we would be grateful if you would share it with someone who might need reminding today that value is so often hidden, not absent, tucked beneath a stair, folded into a forgotten ledger, waiting patiently for someone honest enough to look. We would love to know, in the comments below, what is a time in your own life when you found real worth in something, or someone, that everyone else had already written off. We read every one of them, and we are grateful for every one of you. Until next time, stay close.